I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Sean Cahill, an investigative filmmaker and retired U.S. Navy Chief Master at Arms. He served on various vessels and duty stations abroad. Most notably, he was part of the bridge crew on board the USS Princeton during the infamous Tic-Tac UAP incident with the USS Nimitz in 2004. So, Sean, welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I would love to thank you for your service as well, because I think that's very important to point out. Um, so everybody else approaches these interviews as events unfold. They try and run through kind of a timeline. And so you have told your story like probably 100 times in the media. So I figured I would switch things up a little bit, do things differently. I wanted to start out by asking about follow-up investigations that you've been doing with Lue Elizondo down in Mexico, Ensenada, and off of Guadalupe Island. So you guys have been following up on these Tic-Tac encounters, basically just gathering local stories and doing research about that area. Can you tell me about some of the things that you found down there?
Yeah, there were a lot of overlaps. Most notably and most interestingly were the accounts of the silver balls, and I tend to call them silver basketballs, coming in and out of the water. Especially the stories we received from fishermen out at Guadalupe Island who got really close looks at those. They said that at times they would come up out of the water about 50 feet away and immediately seem to translate right next to the fishing boat. And almost, they said that it felt like it was regarding them or looking at them and then zip away to parts unknown. But the most astonishing was that everywhere we went, and we took about 100 hours of interviews over the course of a few different visits, but everywhere we went, we found witnesses. It didn't matter where we went, whether it was kitchen staff or police officers or the fishermen's co-op or even out at the island.
Now, so was this just mostly one location then, or was this? I mean, from what you've said, I kind of gathered that you guys kind of went down the coast and went to a bunch of maybe different villages and things like that. I'm just wondering kind of what the area is, what the scope of this phenomena seems to be.
So where we went was in and around Ensenada proper, the town, and then we met with the president and major members of the fishing cooperative down there that runs all the fishing in the ports. We met with pilots who make that whole major regional area their domain, as well as numerous fishermen from Ensenada and out at Guadalupe Island. So the stories were pretty much the same. As I was saying, it was, now there were a lot of different actors. Some of the fishermen were seeing very strange things that almost looked like they described them as dragons underwater underneath their fishing boats. Others were very much would seem at home in a James Cameron film like The Abyss. Lots of multicolored lights under the water. Of course, these could have other prosaic explanations, but where it dipped into aerial phenomena of things exiting the water, those overlapped from saucer, lenticular, tic-tac, and spherical shapes.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, and so another hotspot is Catalina Island, right? And in fact, one of the things that's been interesting for me is the USS Kidd encounter that happened in 2019. That's something that I'm currently trying to learn more about. And I understand that UAPX also recently attempted sensor detection and picked up some anomalies in that area as well. Have you guys done any investigations out in the Catalina Island area?
I've not done any investigations out there. I've filmed a Discovery Channel show actually with Gary Voorhees out there, but no actual investigations. I will say that when I was there with Gary on the shuttle from the ferry landing up to our hotel, I jokingly poked him on the shoulder and said, "Watch this." And when we got out of the van, I said, "Hey, anybody around here seen a UFO lately?" And three people walked over to us and pulled out their phones and started showing us photographs or footage that they had taken while on the island recently. And we thought it was pretty funny that worked. I didn't, I was kind of wasn't sure if it would be that big of a deal there, but it turned out to be. Everybody on Catalina also is a witness, it seems like.
Interesting. Yeah, again, that area is so intriguing. So from what I understand, the Nimitz encounter that you were part of is so similar in so many ways to a lot of these reported encounters. So you had said in the past, the roiling in the water, the elongated shape under the water, the other craft acting as tenders to the larger craft are echoed throughout the ocean-related eyewitness accounts. And then you'd also talked about the entry and exit from water without changing the medium. And these are all, I guess, kind of parts of this phenomena, this tic-tac phenomenon in that area, right?
Yeah, they are overlapping. You could almost say comorbidities to the problem. Um, Now, a lot of what you just mentioned there is me taking observational data from the pilots during the Nimitz event, as well as as I said, the approximately 100 hours of interviews that Luis and I did down south, and kind of conflating them together. But there is something to be noticed there. There do seem to be small tender craft. These do seem to be amphibious, for lack of a better word, or exhibiting the one of the five observables, transmedium travel, and in many cases not disturbing that medium in the process. And I find that most interesting because everything that we operate disturbs the medium, almost rips through it. And that's one of the problems about moving through water and air, is that you're essentially ripping through the medium. So if these craft are somehow moving through it without disturbing it, that's something we'd be very interested in understanding.
Yeah, well, and I think that's something that Kevin Newth had talked about as well. And this goes to the SCU, and I'm going a little bit off my questions list here, but he had talked about like the G forces involved, right? So in the Nimitz encounter, they came from, I believe it's believed they originated space. They set off the anti-ballistic missile sensor.
Mhm.
They came down to 80,000 feet, and then they immediately translated down to almost ocean level. The G forces involved would rip apart any kind of airframe. And even if you had an airframe that could withstand it, that kind of acceleration in the atmosphere, I mean, that would just ablate any kind of,
Mhm.
shielding that you could think up. So,
Yeah, there are a few follow-on conclusions as to what the technology exhibits and what our limits to our technology are, that tell us that there's a corner being turned, then that we don't know what's around that corner. Whoever is operating these has a different understanding of some fundamentals than we do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so it's interesting that you and Lou did the follow-up investigations because of his expertise, right, as well as your firsthand knowledge. And both of you have been so deeply involved with this. And then you've had so many years to think about this, right? And so that's one of the things that intrigues me is that you can take an expert in the Pentagon who may have read several books, maybe they went to college. That is not the same thing as having firsthand knowledge. And it's not the same thing as having the time to really think through things. And so that's, for me, that's why it's exciting that you guys are doing these follow-up investigations. Um, so did the locals share any stories of new behaviors or anomalies that we just haven't heard about in the news?
I didn't find anything to be that exciting that would shock us. It was just how often and how close. Everywhere we went, no matter whom we asked, they would tell us where to go to see things. And for example, there's a point in Ensenada called La Bufadora. There's a blowhole there, where the ocean will come through a hole in the
Mm,
rocks, and it's really beautiful. But more sightings have been reported from that lookout, because people are looking out to the sea. They're very attentive to a certain area, so anything that happens there, they're going to see it. But a lot of reports are there, and throughout the city, we kept hearing the same thing, that we triangulated to about 50 miles due west from Ensenada. And interestingly enough, when we went back to our data around Guadalupe Island and off the coast of Ensenada, the places where there were hotspots were also overlapping into what you could call geomagnetic anomalies on the geomagnetic survey map. So there's a lot of information down there, whether size, shape, um, or overlap of stories, that is painting a picture of something that seems to be in the water down there, exiting and entering the water as it needs to. But nothing that was earth-shatteringly exciting. Very run of the mill, but all over the place, as if perhaps they're I mean, that's just 75 miles south of me. I'm 6 miles north of the border. So what's stopping them from coming? Why don't I see them? out in the sky out my window right here all the time. So that's
Yeah.
a question I want to understand.
Well, no, it is again, this entire thing is intriguing. And it seems like again that the follow-ups that you guys have done, it changes the narrative a little bit of this larger story, right? Like, so one of the things I'd wondered about was if this might be some kind of ancient aliens thing. I was like, how long have these been there? Is this something that the Nimitz just kind of stumbled into that's been ongoing? And then I asked myself, how long could this have been going on for? I mean, did the locals have any thoughts in terms of timeline? Like, is this something that's last decade, last 50 years, or is this as long as anybody can
Mhm.
remember?
Most of the locals were very familiar with the topic. It had been interwoven into the local flavor of Christianity that most practice down there, with a little bit of naturalistic, shamanistic, cultural weaving in. Most folks down there were they said they've always been here. Some of those are ancestors, our spirits. Other folks would say they were extraterrestrials. Um, I think if I'm an investigator by trade, that's what I did for the military, and it's pretty obvious that we've been investigating this since at least just post World War II. And the thing is there's no clearinghouse for an academic to go learn about this. There's no place for them to go to get the right info and a good timeline about what has happened. So it's not as academically obvious to them that we've been studying this for a very long time, and that if you go back before that, there are eyewitness accounts and other historical events that paint a picture that say that something similar to this phenomenon we're seeing now has been present at times throughout our history. Now, I won't say whether or not that is the origin of our myth or legend or religion, et cetera, as many like to say, but the presence seems to be here. So I think in a lot of ways that leads us to present day, to AARO and their tasking to research all the way back to World War II. But I think that the powers that be in leadership, they need a sight picture of what the modern intelligence apparatus, military and scientific apparatus of the military industrial complex, what that sight picture is that they have of this phenomenon, the whether classified or unclassified, and that needs to be sanitized and shared with the people as well.
Yeah, yeah. So what are your thoughts on how the government is approaching this currently? And again, you just mentioned Arrow. I mean, one of the things that intrigues me is that they're still talking about, quote unquote, foreign powers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it seems, I mean, to me, it seems pretty clear that none of our adversaries are even close to this level of technology. So, uh, I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts on I guess the narrative and the approach for study?
I The learning curve for the reality of this phenomenon is not only very steep, it's very slippery. Um, and I think that you see a lot of folks that are at different parts in that journey. Now, I'm someone who's observed the phenomenon throughout most of my life. I've come and gone with my interest to it or how much influence it had on what was going on in my life or whether I cared. And I'm trained in the military and in police and investigative and anti-terrorism techniques, so I'm a little bit different than your average UFO person. That gives me a different set of skills to look at this. And what I see right now is I see a lot of people trying to wrap their heads around something that they were told they didn't have to deal with, that it wasn't real and it wasn't part of their reality. And these people are a lot of times they're in leadership now. So they're gonna take Occam's razor to this every chance they get. The first thing they have to rule out is prosaic explanations. The second thing they have to do is look at our national defense. And the last thing they're going to get to is extraterrestrial, crypto terrestrials, and time travelers. So and I think at the end of the day, their own personal philosophy and their education also takes a seat there and informs them. So this isn't easy for everybody. Just saying UFOs are real hasn't even happened yet for the average person. That's not something that is a true statement to everybody yet.
Yeah, well, it's intellectual versus emotional acceptance, and that's something that I mean, again, I've struggled with as well, right? I mean, and then I guess there is this element of UFOs, much like zombie movies, were a representation of communism during the Cold War, right? And so it was really easy to dismiss them and say, well, UFOs aren't real. This is, this is mass hysteria. This is panic about communism, just like the zombies. It's, strangers among us, And so to come back to this now and say, wait a minute, UFOs are actually real, like real, that, there's intellectual knowledge, and then there's that gut level feel. And I think that you're right. That's a giant struggle for most people to accept. So, well, so I mean, there are a growing list of theories on what could be going on here. You mentioned a couple of them. Now, popular culture says they're extraterrestrials, right? I mean, we've got at least 70 years of that, plus, H.G. Wells, Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, the whole 9 yards there. So they could be from outer space. Interestingly, there's also this thread that they could be time travelers, maybe interdimensionals, crypto-terrestrials, and then there's also this. To me, it's interesting, this idea of this connection to the oceans. I guess it's something that's kind of been there for a long time, but it's never had much publicity. And I think your experience with the Nimitz is bringing all of that to light. What's your hunch on where they're from?
I think it's going to be all of the above. If we're looking at a one source entity, say, or and when I say entity, they could be, say, a pan-national group. That's fine with me. But let's say that they're one homogenous group that's here. I think that we're going to find that a lot of those words that you said, whether time travel, interdimensional, crypto, etc., are all possibly applicable. Because for me, one of the most obvious things, and I'm sure a physicist would correct me, but I'm talking about something we that's intuitive rather than mathematical. If these craft are doing what it seems that we're observing they're doing, it seems they're leaving this reality at one point and exiting and entering at other points, whether through warping of space or some other means that we don't understand yet. To me, that speaks of a dimensionality beyond the reality we understand, and perhaps a dimensionality where time is not as linear as we experience it, where it has a more dimensional feeling. Now, just because I can't wrap my head around that doesn't mean it's not real. And I think that would put all of that under the same hat as something that had that kind of understanding and control of time and reality and matter would move about in a way that would seem like they were time travelers, or that they had been here for millions of years if they had left evidence, etc. So for me, it wouldn't surprise me if it's all of the above. I have the hardest time with the zeitgeist that speaks of, though we sit at the bottom of this gravity well in the seemingly infinite universe, I still don't feel like there's 1,000 different varieties of alien coming to this planet constantly, from this huge universe. That just seems, it seems ridiculous that we would have such a lack of understanding while being such a hot spot, according to
Yeah.
so many people. I think that's the thing that I have a hard time wrapping my head around.
No, I completely agree with you. It's interesting, as well as this idea of Dr. Julia Mossbridge has said this to me. I'd had a conversation a while back with her about this, and I was talking with her about von Neumann probes and exploring the galaxy, and self-replicating probes and all that stuff. And when I got into the scale of time and the expanse of space involved, she kind of stopped me. She said, Tim, when you're talking about those scales, they lose their meaning. She's like,
Mm-hmm.
time and space aren't necessarily what you think, and it might not even be fair to try and put them into that box, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of stuck with me. What you've said about this instantaneous, translation is a good word, right? The tic-tac
Mm-hmm.
seems to disappear at one point and reappear at another.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I don't know, some kind of time phenomena, maybe. So
Yeah, there's aspects to this that I think the human brain wants to make it fit on that linear dualistic journey. And I don't think that at the heart of this phenomenon, when we're dealing with five observables craft and or their builders, occupants, or so-called pilots, I think we're dealing with something that's not necessarily coming from a linear dualistic explanation. So
Yeah. Well, so in terms of what you saw yourself on the USS Princeton, and again, this is so well documented. You've said that it was about 10 p.m. Kevin Day had been asking for aerial observations all week. You were out with the port watch. He'd requested that you be on deck, and this was something where he had been just acting a little different all week. And he said, "Well, just go out there with the port watch."
mhm.
And so you were at the port side lookout. You saw 5 stars about 45 degrees up, and I think they were about 2,000 feet off the port bow.
Mhm.
Move counterclockwise to a center point where each one blinked out. Right. Um, I mean, have you seen anything since then? Have you seen any other reports that are kind of like that? I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the specific event.
I have seen other reports since then. I've been fortunate enough that anything similar to the event, a lot of friends and fans have sent me just about anything that even smelled slightly similar to it. So I've had a chance to really see just how many other people have seen similar. I've had some people contact me with very emotional responses about having seen literally the same thing and or seen it out here in San Diego or something like that. In all my years of being in the military, I've seen every manner of aircraft. I was present in Florida at Cape Canaveral on a field trip with my school during the Challenger accident. I'm very familiar with aerospace. Um, I'd never seen anything like this. It didn't make sense. They were most assuredly not missiles or tracers or other aircraft. The sky was clear. Um, and one of the when I explained that to Lue Elizondo for the first time, for example, he had a look on his face that was just like, "Yep, I've heard this before. This scans. This sounds right." And since then, I've learned that that's other people have seen very similar, especially when they're in a grouping. Um, it didn't make any sense. It made no sense what I saw because it was, as I said, very clear sky, nothing to occlude those lights, no reason for them to move and then go out the way they did. It would have to be a wild explanation for it, and in the middle of an exercise where we were looking for UFOs, and that's frankly what we were looking for at that moment. That I don't need to assume they weren't seagulls. I know that. Um, it's left me baffled all these years, but since then I have seen other things that have baffled me even further. Whether it's very very large craft or those, as described, those silver basketballs here in the local area of where I live. Um, I don't have a good explanation.
Yeah.
That I have none. And I'm a professional investigator. I'm supposed to have the only explanation I have is there's something we don't understand here. And some people who tend to look up a lot see it more than others.
Well, no, and the behavior of these seems
Mhm,
almost organic in a way, and that's why I wondered if what it reminded me of was that first Star Trek encounter at Farpoint, right, where
mhm,
they meet it's the space creature, and it lives in space, but it's actually kind of a being,
mhm,
and that's what this behavior, in a sense, almost reminded me of, and that's something that I've heard other places as well. And I think that that's something that Commander Fravor kind of reported as well,
mhm,
right? With the
mhm.
flight, it there's something organic to the way it moves, I guess.
Yeah, I could attribute that on the one hand to, all artificial systems are that we are aware of have been organized and designed by organic systems. So of course we're gonna mimic what we know. But at the same time, I agree. There's a sense of life that isn't the same that you get with a helicopter or
Yeah.
an airplane or a boat or even a fast moving drone per se. There is something very organic to it.
Yeah. Well, so let me come back to the government here. Have you been contacted by Arrow or any of the organizations, the official? I mean, other than Lou, right? Because I know he was involved with ATIP, but um, with this new effort, I guess, that's trying to investigate this and bring it all to light, has anyone come to you for your statement, come to you to try and gather information to understand what's going on?
Not from AARO, not in an official sense with the new office. Back in July of 21, I was fortunate enough to attend a meeting in Colorado Springs at an undisclosed location. There were representatives from SpaceCom, Space Force, National Reconnaissance Office, SOCOM. And this was, I would say, the preliminary days of trying to figure out how we were going to get to where we were today. Getting the right people in the right room to meet each other, former undersecretaries of defense, pretty highly placed people within each of those organizations who all had a stake in understanding the phenomenon. We're meeting to begin networking to try to figure out how do we get to leadership. We understand what Luis went through, that he could not even get in the ear of leadership to tell them what was going on. So how are we going to do that? So my place in this has been more in the foundational aspects of it, helping organize and network. That was why we set up our company, Skyfort. In a lot of ways, that was Skyfort was the clipboard and hard hat and safety vest that allowed us to walk a little bit further towards the action than we would have been able to do had we been just individuals. For some reason, when you present people with a business card and an LLC, they just immediately assume, well, this is business, let's start talking, instead of you just being a person. So once we achieved what we wanted to, as far as networking and understanding in the Beltway and seeing where things were moving, we shut Skyfort down. We closed our LLC down to maintain our ethics and make sure that we never had any intention of cashing in on this. A lot of people, a lot of people immediately get accused of grift. It's a word people like to throw around a lot, but they don't seem to look it up in the dictionary first before they use it. But we wanted to really make sure that we avoided appearances of that. I have not been contacted directly by the AARO, but to be honest with you, between you and I, my story is not the most interesting. It's already a matter of record. It's on a TV show. It's the folks that weren't allowed to tell their stories or were told not to log it and not to talk about it that we really need to get in front of Congress. And those folks are lining up now.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that's a good point. I mean, so in the last few months, I've heard that several hundred of these reports have come out, right? And but then there are other folks as well. Like for instance, the port lookout that we're with. I think you'd mentioned that individual saw it, and to my understanding, they probably still haven't come forward yet, right? So.
Not sure who it was. I could give a physical description of the person, but going through my cruise book, which is kind of like a yearbook of the time you were there, I couldn't find him in there. So he may have been from a period of the crew that didn't get to the picture day. But also the watch bills from that portion of our deployment and our crews are no longer available. They're not in the record as they should be. They're another piece of the puzzle that disappeared along with the radar tapes.
Yeah, you'd mentioned that. I guess the quote unquote men in black almost in this case, right?
That's how it's described by the rumor mill.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the other parts I wanted to touch on was the story itself. Again, the story keeps changing. I mean, the NDA 2023 mandates that aero research now they're looking all the way back, I think, to the 1947, 1945, around that era. And includes any evidence of retrievals if those exist. And it's interesting to see online, people are kind of manipulating that language to say, oh, the UFOs have been retrieved. Well, no, that's, I read through it and it's like, if they were retrieved, or, they want this in a report, it's going to come out at the end of the year. We do have hundreds of new UAP reports that have been filed in the last few months. Do you think there are any takeaways from this? I mean, is this moving in the right direction, do you think?
Most assuredly. First of all, we're talking now about, we've had discussions as to, we have retrieved material, but it was not very interesting. Well, hold on, let's back up to the fact that you retrieved material. Well,
yeah.
You didn't send firemen and police officers to do that. You sent crash retrieval teams. That means you had crash retrieval programs in effect. So good, we can start there. Let's open up all the books on those teams and let's see that. So there's a lot of follow-on implications. A lot of people get bowled over by the information because they're waiting to get to, is it aliens and when do we get to see them? and all of that other stuff. But if we're going to research back to 1945, again, that tells us this has been researched. And Project Sign, Project Grudge, the Condon Report, the Project Blue Book, of course, then ATIP, etc. What these tell us is that this keeps getting investigated, and then those that attain the information they're looking for then go, okay, yeah, let's shut this down. We're going to rename it. We're going to move it into the black, and we're not going to talk about this anymore. And if that keeps happening, there's obviously something to hide here. So my question is in a garbage in, garbage out system like the United States government, you're only going to get the information that someone hands to you, unless you have the authority to go dig for information that may not have seen the light of day yet. So we'll see what kind of teeth the AARO has.
I mean, it's interesting, in terms of, I guess, attaining that level of information, and then what you said, they go, I mean, I've looked at it a few different ways, and I'm just spitballing, but one of them is reading about like these nuclear encounters, right? When I read through some of those, I thought, well, if you're an investigator, they send you out to the middle of Montana or something. You get off a plane. I mean, it's cold, it's desolate. You got a bunch of guys. The first thing I would ask is, how much have you guys had to drink? Now, so I think in terms of reporting, I think that's one issue is, we look back in history and we see this cluster of events, one after another, after another, after another. But at the time, it was like, okay, everything is calm, everything is moving as it should, and then something strange happens. It's easy to dismiss that, so that's one aspect of it. I guess the other aspect you'd mentioned, like crash retrieval teams and stuff like that. Are there any indications that they've actually had those? I mean, is that coming to light, or is that something that's still speculative?
I can say that from my standpoint, I don't usually talk in rumor, but the unofficial word is that yes, of course there have been, probably as related to special warfare teams, trained to do those things. Now, between you and I, your average person is never going to know the difference between whether or not, and this includes some of the team members as well. You're going to go do the mission you're given, whether that's an F-117, a B-2, a Lockheed prototype that we don't want to fall into the wrong hands, or something that fell from the stars. The protocols are going to be about the same, and the standard operating procedures for those teams are going to be about the same. The investigators are going to end up looking at logistics. Where did the things that were retrieved, where did they go to? If everything's going to Wright-Patterson, if everything's falling out under the UFO zeitgeist blanket that's expected, it's going to be pretty easy. But again, are the investigators and the let's say the staffers, are they familiar with that zeitgeist at all? I dare say they're going to have to grab a UFO person here or there, and I'm not volunteering for that by any stretch, but they're going to have to grab somebody that knows the wheat from the chaff, and that can tell them where to start looking. Because if they start fresh as a green investigator thinking that UFOs don't exist, they have a long uphill climb.
Yeah. There's a lot of history, and it's very convoluted, and there's a lot of psychology involved with this too, right? And it's as I mentioned a moment ago, it's easy to dismiss it. On the other side of it, I think one of the reasons that you might want to push this down would be, if I was in the military, I would not want to admit to my superiors or to the public that there's something going on that we just can't control, right?
I've said that from day one. There's no admiral that wants to tell the SecDef we don't control the battle space.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things. I mean, that in itself could be a reason enough to kind of push things down. Just say, look, we know what the Soviets are doing, but this other thing is going on. We have no idea how to, manage this.
Well, that's a good place to say that, we know that the Soviets had their own psychological programs that were that were less than benign, and that may even had something to do with the phenomenon. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that my own government only does nice things, but there are aspects of this that you don't even need to know what's going on. You could be an aspect of psychological warfare that says, hey, UFOs aren't real and neither is Bigfoot or Loch Ness monster. Let's use that as a means to mess with the enemy. We have no idea who's going to try to hide what in the years to come from this investigation. And secondly, how many people in the zeitgeist, let alone the government, have been stating truths thinking that the truth would never get told.
Yeah.
And now that the truth is somewhat knocking on the door, they're probably rather frightened, especially if they're really far down the road with their BS.
Yeah, no, that's well, and the Russians, they have their own collection of UAP
Mm-hmm.
stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the impression that I get is that they've had a lot of the same struggles,
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
Well, as with our, and I don't want to rile any one polarized end here, but as with our politics, the Russians have a vested interest in making sure that Americans in general have the wrong information.
yeah,
So people who are interested in the field of UFOs should not immediately accept everything as gospel. You don't know what the origin of this is, and the Russians were very interested in making sure that we just looked like fools when it came to this subject.
yeah, no, that's a good point. And they used it to cover up ICBM missile tests as well, right?
Hmm.
So, you know,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I wanted to ask about, and again, I'm switching topics yet again a little bit, but one of the things that interested me was, again, when I was writing the questions during the Iraq War, my brother's unit, he was in the airborne, they took heavy casualties, and when they came home, the folks who were left, they really developed a strong camaraderie. They went through something together, right? And I was wondering, do you have kind of a camaraderie like that with Lou, Kevin, Gary, David, or Alex, the people who have come forward and spoken about this event? Has that kind of brought you guys together?
I would say that everybody that served has a sense of family. Whenever you bump into somebody else who served, there's always a sense of family, especially after you've gotten out and you've worked in the civilian sector again and realize how much easier it is to fall back into anything with somebody who served. Yeah, seeing Gary again after all those years was just like being back on the boat with him. Lou and I have a that's where we bonded, was on our being stuck on a boat out to Guadalupe for about a week together and everything. We got to know each other, and we'd had enough similar experiences and laughed at the same jokes and knew the same people that yeah. I don't know Commander Fravor or Commander Dietrich, but I imagine that just being in their presence, I would probably call them ma'am and sir, just from having been a chief petty officer. I'd probably fall back into that. But there's a definite camaraderie. There's a definite tie that binds. There's something about going through that voluntary shared trauma of military service, even without having shared combat experience together, that really keeps you tied together.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I was thinking above and beyond simply the military service, also the encounters and then the
Mm,
media and the uncertainty and all of it, right? And you guys have gone through, I mean, not together, but even just individually, you guys have gone through something really unique,
yeah.
and I thought, again, thinking back to with Iraq, it's kind of like he could only talk to those people because they were the only people who'd gone through that.
Yeah, there's a sense of that to it. I lean heavily on Lou, but yeah,
Yeah.
Kevin is another person that there's some stuff that I'll talk to him about that I won't talk to the same with other folks. Um, for a long time, and Kevin and I have talked about this before. For a long time, there was just no one to talk to about it, and there was only each other. And so, the remainder of the time Kevin and I had on the ship together, we did talk about it a lot. It's been very healing for a lot of us since Lou came out, to be able to discuss this in the way that it is, to sit here with you and be taken seriously, to
Yeah.
have a serious conversation about it. We've come a very, very long way. I'm very, very optimistic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that in itself is an enormous achievement, right? To be able to move forward and I guess move on, right? Not necessarily put it behind you, but at least be able to move forward and on.
Hmm.
So, well, Sean, let me thank you for your time. And again, let me thank you so much for your career of service and for everything that you've done to move this story and move this narrative forward and bring this out into the public light. Let me close by asking what comes next for you, and with your intuition, what do you think that we can expect to see in this ongoing UAP story?
Well, I'll say that we didn't expect to get as far as fast as we did. Um, so in a lot of ways, I've been really considering taking a step back and exiting from this. We never thought we would get as the amazing amount of response that we did, and plus to have it in law and to have it be, have the government have it where it's supposed to be in the right oversight. Um, but it looks like we're going to move into the international piece now. This is not just America's problem.
Yeah.
This is not an issue that's just centered here, whether or not we have, the largest military or the best sensors or the most people looking up at the sky. I don't know, but we've been working the last few years to build the same kind of networks in Great Britain and in Europe that we were building here for, and I'm sure you've seen recently the Project Titan is moving forward with the country of San Marino and the United Nations. So I think that if I were a betting man, I would say that this is not going to go away. It's going to be up to the American people and the American government to make sure that the proper oversight occurs here in the United States. But it's time that we moved in onto the international stage. There are other governments out there, other programs, other people, other foundations, and other groups that can bring their acumen to bear on this. And it's most definitely a global problem. So the United Nations should be involved.
Wonderful. Sean, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Tim. Take care.